Welcome again. Welcome to everybody who's come back, and welcome to people who this is your first day. Maybe you're filling in for your agency or got to come today. So this is day 2 of Mental Wellness Summit Part 2. I also would like to start today by acknowledging that we get to, we're having these learnings on the traditional territories of the Kwanlin-Dun First Nation and the Tonquichan Council. Incredibly important acknowledgement when we're talking about healthcare and mental wellness and making changes to those. So for those of you who are new, bathrooms require a key card. You can get one on the desk just out front if there's not one on your table. And exits just over here to the left or just out there to the right. I think we'll jump right into it today. I was sort of going to start there. We've got some boards around the outside. I was just going to introduce that idea for those of you who are in the room. Since being a part of Mental Wellness Summit, the first one and now this second one, I get asked a question a lot. I was asked it this morning and numerous times prior, and that was, what is the purpose of the summit, or what's the outcomes? Some people are more blunt. What's the point? And I was thinking about that last night, and we heard a lot of things yesterday around just the interconnectedness of programs. It sounded like not one single presentation, at least that I attended or got to see yesterday, was around this is the one approach. It was this is how we need to connect with others. So in a very selfish way, I guess I'm going to pose that question to you folks who are here. I don't know if I could answer what the outcome of the summit would be for Whitehorse versus Dawson City versus Pelly Crossing, or from the approach of someone who's working in a hospital or responding to an overdose or living with somebody who's living with chronic alcoholism or other mental wellness issues. I think that comes from all of us. So I guess on the side here, you'll see 3 boards, which are sort of leaned up on chairs. They have some questions around what we think might be proposed outcomes or immediate needs, long-term needs. Tomorrow, we're going to have an opportunity to sit amongst all of our peers and sort of divide up and have discussions around what we think is most needed in, maybe it's our immediate community, maybe it's our agency, maybe it's our government. So to just encourage people, I was sort of sitting reflecting on that question myself last night and just posing that here. What is your desired outcome? And then who are the, when I got to go last night to the Beringy Center and listen to the Indigenous Youth Toolkit, which you folks will be very fortunate to hear about this afternoon. Very fortunate to hear about this afternoon. It was amazing. And the concept came up of allies, the question of who are your allies in this. And I think maybe that's a question for us too. Who are our partners? Who are our allies? Who do we need to connect with if we have an innovation or a creative approach, or we found a way to remove a barrier to service in some way? So there are those boards around, and I just encourage people to reflect on that, and we'll have an opportunity to openly discuss it in groups tomorrow. So no pressure to start your day, but something to think about. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Johnstone. Dr. Lucy Johnstone is visiting us this week from the UK, and Lucy is a consult clinical psychologist and author who is joining us to speak on the power threat meaning framework for the next hour. So I think that's all my duties as an MC. Nothing else I'm supposed to say?
That's absolutely fine.
Okay, perfect.
Just wait there till I work out if I can operate this flicker, because I'm not very good at technology. Is it simple? I've heard some fascinating presentations, and I hope to pick up some of those themes as I go through my talk today. So it's a little bit of a rapid overview that I'm going to do today. I'm going to describe quite a large and complicated project that took 5 years to put together. And I've got some slides which have quite a lot of words on. Just to let you know, do not feel you have to read all the words on all the slides. You're welcome to have the slides. I will summarise the most important bits in each slide, but I want to whiz through and give you a flavour of this approach. And there may not be a lot of time for questions afterwards, because I don't want to overrun too much, but I'm around the rest of the day and tomorrow if anyone wants to come and catch me afterwards. So, final warning, what I'm going to say is going to be a little bit provocative in places. I hope it is my purpose to be provocative. It's absolutely not my purpose to say you have to look at it this way and you have to agree with me and this is the right way of doing it. To pick up what Cameron just said, I don't think there is a right way, but the way I'm going to offer you, I hope, has something to offer to the problems that you're facing, particularly in this part of the world. And one of the strengths that I hope it has is that it's very supportive and validating of Indigenous First Nations perspectives. Now, I'm not an Indigenous person, and therefore I don't want to say anything more than that, but offer a few humble suggestions as we go through, and I hope that that will make some sense to you and be very interested to hear about your feedback. So, what is the Power Threat Meaning Framework? But just before I get to that, I want to put in a tiny bit of context. Because I don't know, I'm never quite sure how far this news has spread. It's spread quite a long way in the UK, but there is a crisis in our psychiatric diagnostic system. So the idea that people suffering various very real forms of distress are best seen as needing to be diagnosed with a mental illness has come under very powerful challenge recently. And if I had to describe the Power Threat Meaning Framework in a nutshell, the thing I'm here to describe, I would say it's a radical alternative to the diagnostic model. It's a completely different way based on completely different principles of understanding and perhaps supporting people to heal from distress. So here are some of my favourite quotes from very senior psychiatrists who in fact drew up the previous edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that came out in 2013. There's no reason to believe it's safe or scientifically sound. It's an absolute scientific nightmare. Patients deserve better. So those are quite damning statements, and in fact a lot of effort has been put into devising new manuals from scratch, things called RDoC and HITOP, and which you don't really need to know about. I think they're going on the wrong lines, but anyway, it very much should be open to us to question the current system, because even the people who put these manuals together are questioning it themselves. And here is one of my favourite reports from the United Nations in 2017, so very senior people are saying this kind of thing. Diagnostic tools continue to expand the parameters of individual diagnosis, often without a solid scientific basis. We've been sold a myth that the best solutions for addressing mental health challenges are medications and other biomedical interventions. Now, you don't have to agree with that, but I think you need to know that people are saying this kind of stuff, quite challenging stuff. And two of the recommendations from that report are that we need to target social determinants. We should be looking at the power imbalance, not the chemical imbalance. I think that's a really powerful way of looking at it and probably very relevant to a lot of the problems we've been talking about here. And the UK, where I come from, does have quite a strong radical tradition. It's not the dominant tradition. In most hospitals and clinics, you see very much the same diagnostic stuff going on. But my professional body, the Division of Clinical Psychology, in 2013, exactly the same time as DSM came out, issued this statement saying we need a paradigm shift, we need to abandon the medical model of distress. Another very dramatic statement. Not all psychologists like me agree with it, but I think it's very important that it's out there. Now, perhaps it's worth me saying at this point, I'm really not here to say nobody should use a diagnostic label and it's not about stripping labels off people. People need and have the right to describe their distress in the way that makes most sense to them. And in the world we live in, purely pragmatically, we often need a diagnosis to get access to services and benefits and so on. So really not challenging any of that, but I think we need to be aware of the challenges that are being posed to this whole way of thinking, and at the very least aware that there are alternatives. Okay, and just very briefly, a lot of this is ridiculously brief. One of the alternatives which is widely used in the UK, which I haven't come across very much elsewhere, is called a formulation. So all psychologists in the UK are trained in formulation, which is a kind of pompous word for a story, really. A formulation is the result of sitting down with someone, hearing about their difficulties. The professional will bring their knowledge of research, for example, of trauma-informed practice. The person they're working with will talk about the difficulties they've had, and it's possible to put this together into kind of personal narrative or a kind of best guess about what might be our best way of understanding your difficulties and what might be the best ways forward. A process of ongoing collaborative sense-making. So it's not a fixed thing like a diagnosis, you have this illness or disorder. It's an ongoing conversation, if you like. And the core assumptions of formulations are that essentially we're dealing with people with problems, not patients with illnesses. And the things that we call symptoms in psychiatric terms are perhaps best understood as survival mechanisms. This is very much in line with trauma-informed practice, isn't it? Perhaps they were necessary at the time, but over a period they can become problematic in their own right. But essentially the message of every formulation is you are experiencing understandable reaction to abnormal circumstances, and anyone else who'd been through the same events might have ended up feeling the same way. That's very different from the message of a diagnosis, which however much you kind of wrap it up is essentially about the problem is somehow in you and there's something wrong, rather than something right and necessary but it actually has come to have some disadvantages. So I've invented this. This is what a formulation might look in UK terms. This is the kind of thing that a UK psychologist might put together. This would be an alternative to, let's say, a diagnostic label like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or anything like that. But a formulation put together over a period of time, perhaps weeks, perhaps months, between two people might end up looking something like this. Can you read that from the back? Or? Yeah, I mean, there's actually no need to read every word, but essentially what it's saying is you had a difficult life, you started hearing voices partly as a result of this, and recent events have triggered a kind of reminder of the abuse you suffered earlier in your life. And perhaps it's not surprising all this stuff has come to the surface, but actually you have a lot of strengths and self-awareness, and you can find a way forward. So I think you can see that's rather a different message from there's something wrong with you. This is very much more a what's happened to you message. So the framework that I'm about to describe, finally, draws on this tradition of formulation, which is a kind of narrative. It builds on a lot of existing stuff. It also builds on trauma-informed practice and a whole range of other theories and approaches, although it's much wider than formulation. I think formulation is something that has particular uses in UK services, but in the framework we wanted to think about narrative in a much more broader sense, which might include the narratives, art, music, poetry, song, dance, narratives that are common perhaps in non-Western cultures before people are introduced to diagnostic understandings. So the framework was put together by these people. The people in the top paragraph are psychologists and survivors. Jackie Dillon and Ellen Longdon are, I don't know if they're known over here, but they're internationally known survivors, people. That's a UK term for someone who's kind of escaped psychiatry and has put it behind them. So in the UK terms, we'd call that a co-produced project. It's not just about psychologists or professionals. And the whole project group, and this took 5 years to put together, was about 40 people, about a third of whom had had personal experience of using psychiatric services. And as I said, it's a very ambitious attempt to outline an alternative to the diagnostic model. It's funded by my professional body, but it's not an official model for psychologists. Some like it, some hate it, and there's all shades in between. Even I don't think it's perfect. It's a process of, it's meant to be an evolving process. And when we published it in 2018 in London, the idea, it's a set of ideas. What it really isn't, it isn't a how-to manual. It isn't about saying, do this in these situations, run your services like this, do your therapy like this. It's a set of very basic core principles, which we hope people would take and adapt and find out if they worked and feedback to us, and that would go feedback into a further ongoing evaluation of the project, which is exactly what's happened. There's now many, many power threat meaning framework-based projects in the UK, in a number of places in Denmark and Spain, and I've been to Brazil and Australia and New Zealand and a number of other places. So it seems that there is a widespread recognition that what we're doing somehow isn't really working and we need something different. And it's really not saying everything you're doing is wrong, do this instead. It's about saying we can offer extra support and validation for the lots of very good non-diagnostic work that's already going on, and we can possibly suggest other ways forward. And really important to say, it's about all of us. This is not a new way of understanding people who are mentally ill. We actually don't see a division between people who are said to be mentally ill and the rest of us. That's part of the way of thinking we're trying to move away from. Okay, and if you're at all interested, there's the website, has lots of stuff on it, podcasts, blogs, examples of this being put into practice. It's got the main documents. It's all free. We were very free that the main documents, which are quite long and dense, very keen that the main documents, which are quite long and dense, are actually accessible and free to anyone. On your table, you have a little flyer, and the yellow one, the yellow book on the flyer, is possibly the easiest way into the framework if you're very new to it and if you want to find out more. I have a few copies of that book to sell, if anyone who wants to rush up very quickly and waving dollar bills at me at the end. If not, PCCS Books does send things overseas. And the yellow book is a simple, accessible introduction, we hope, and it takes you step by step through how you might want to put together a power threat meaning framework narrative for yourself, because this is about all of us, for someone you're working with or supporting. Okay, as I said, it's received a lot of attention, both positive and negative. It's quite well known in the UK. Maybe it'll become known in Yukon, who knows? Along with a lot of all the other good stuff that you're doing that we heard about yesterday and will be hearing about today. So the framework draws on trauma-informed practice, as I said, and this is quite a well-embedded approach around here, isn't it? More so than in the UK, I would say. I think trauma-informed practice has a lot to offer. We also think, as authors of the framework, that there are some potential problems with using trauma-informed practice. One is that it isn't always an alternative to diagnosis. So from our point of view, that's not something we'd support. PTSD, well, that describes a very real set of experiences, doesn't it? But is this a disorder? We would rather call it something, an understandable response to extreme stress, let's say. We also think that there's a danger of trauma-informed practice perhaps being focused in a too individualistic a way, your trauma response, as opposed to looking at all the contributors to anyone's trauma response, and as opposed to looking at all the more background insidious factors that actually contribute to distress, that are the roots of distress, like inequality, social exclusion, discrimination, colonization, devalued identities, and so on. And in addition, the framework suggests ways of understanding people's distress when there isn't a history of obvious trauma as we usually understand it, which is very common. A lot of people will say, well, I had nothing awful happen to me and had a safe, comfortable upbringing, and I'm lucky enough to have a good job and a lovely family and so on. Why am I struggling so much? Well, a lot of the answer to that, we think, lies in more subtle things like the whole set of expectations that we're expected to live up to in competitive materialistic societies. I'm speaking about the UK here. The kind of, the corrosive effects of social inequality that affect all of us in a society. So there's plenty of reasons for all of us to experience distress, even without obvious traumas. So, in the briefest possible way, summary, the PTMF suggests that instead of diagnostic understandings, we need narrative ones. And it suggests ways of putting together narratives which recognize that emotional distress and troubled or troubling behavior are understandable responses to a person's history and circumstances. Not always easily understandable, but the principle we start from is that there is a way of understanding it. that restores the link between distress and social injustice. These are not just individual disorders, there is a link. That increases people's access to power and resources, helps to create validating and empowering narratives, not just for people at a one-to-one level, for groups, for communities, and promotes social action, because ultimately, I don't need to tell you this, what we need to do to tackle distress as its roots is social action. That's the roots of distress. We can't deal with everyone on a one-to-one basis on a mental health clinic. So in order to put together narratives, the framework suggests a very rough structure. And this structure is an expansion of the term which I'm sure you'll be familiar with. Instead of asking what's wrong with me, ask what's happened to me. So we've expanded that core question in this way. What has happened to you? How has power operating in your life? How did it affect you? What kind of threats does this pose? What sense did you make of it? What is the meaning of these experiences to you? What did you have to do to survive? What kinds of threat responses are you using? I'm going to elaborate on this in a minute. And in one-to-one work, you might want to start with what are your strengths, or end with, or weave it in. And to pull it all together, what is your story? So this is really, really not meant to be another form of assessment schedule. This isn't about sit down, tick list, what happened to you, tick, tick, tick. This is a very loose way of structuring a narrative which will evolve over a period of time, which you can put together on your own or with the support of someone else. And you don't have to use those words. If those words aren't familiar to you or don't make sense to you, use any words you like. But this is a rough suggested structure for putting together a narrative. And the reason we put power first is because we think consideration of power is what's missing by definition from psychiatry. Psychiatric diagnosis, by definition, suggests that the problem is somewhere inside your head, if you like, inside you as an individual. There's no room for a power understanding. But power is also missing from a lot of psychological and psychotherapeutic approaches. So we're against individualization in general, if you like, not just saying we need alternatives to diagnosis. And you don't need to read all the detail on that slide, but essentially we've outlined a number of different types of power which we think need to be considered when we're thinking about someone's story. And some of these we're used to thinking about if we're working in a trauma-informed way. We're used to thinking about interpersonal abuses, for example. We're less used to thinking about some of the other abuses, for example, people's economic and material conditions, which of course can lead to distress. We're yet less used to thinking about social and cultural capital, the kind of subtle ways in which some of us, and I'm a good example of this, have been fortunate enough to be born with quite a lot of social capital. I'm white, I'm middle class, I'm educated, I'm able-bodied. I've had some disadvantages in my life as well, but on the whole, I've started with a lot of advantages that many of the people we work with, if we're professionals, don't have. And of course, by applying a diagnostic understanding, we sometimes create further barriers to people's access to forms of employment and joining in community life and so on. But we think power is a central starting point because it's everywhere in our lives, even when we're not aware of it. And all the major causes of mental health problems, and this is well established by research, involve inequalities of power. So if you think about it, poverty, low social status, large differences in wealth and income, child abuse and neglect, gender-based, race-based violence, colonization, war and conflict, all arise out of power differences between one group of people and another. Yeah, that's why we're very inclined to kind of ignore that. We very much need to put that first and foremost. And in doing that, we need to consider a particular form of power that we think is often ignored, overlooked. It's often quite hard to detect because ideological power, as we've defined it, power over meaning, language and perspective, it's kind of more subtle in a way. It's about the kind of assumptions we all take on board without thinking about them. It's about the messages we get from social media, from our education. It's about the things we don't challenge because it seems to us that the world just is this way or should be this way. And very often it involves some people who have more power invalidating the perspectives of people who have less power. It often, of course, operates by stereotyping certain groups, people who are black or indigenous or working class or whatever. And the the views of the people who are more powerful are the ones that tend to be taken as the right ones and the correct ones. So how does this work in practice? Well, we have all sorts of ways of defining distress so that we don't have to look at the power operations, so that we kind of blame the victims, if you like. Rape, we may see messages that imply she asked for it. Poverty, in the UK, I'm afraid we sometimes use words like they're welfare scroungers, they're not working hard enough. Coercive abuse, I didn't say that, and so on. And we also want to add to this the consequences of trauma and mental health problems when we say, therefore you're psychotic or personality disorder or mentally ill. We think that's the same kind of process. We think that's a process of powerful professionals imposing a form of understanding via a use of language which essentially blames the individual and hides the operation of power. And indeed, in general, in mental health and criminal justice systems, the whole diagnostic narrative is used to turn social problems into individual ones and diagnose and define people as bad or mad. So we see this as actually a form of abuse of power. As I said, some people will need diagnoses for certain reasons. Some people find that a helpful way of understanding their problems. But what routinely happens in services is that you get told as though it's a fact, despite all the caveats we heard at the beginning of the talk, that you have bipolar disorder, you have a psychosis, you have schizophrenia, you have a personality disorder. And people are not allowed to object. You can describe this as a form of epistemic injustice, a form of knowledge, a kind of form of understanding is being imposed on you by a powerful other. And of course, if you object, you quickly find out where the power lies, you'll be lacking in insight. And if you accept, you will find yourself very often open to further abuses of power, to being forced to take, let's say, medication that you don't want, or being locked up or something like that. So when we focus on power, it's much harder to assimilate everything back in what happened into what's wrong. So power is the process that links the personal political, links distress to inequalities and social injustice, links the social, psychological and biological, makes distress fully intelligible, helps restore agency. People sense that they can have some control over their lives. And yeah, I mean, there are lots of examples around here. It's not a surprise that people from indigenous communities have higher suicide rates, alcoholism rates, and clearly, you know, I don't need to say this to any of you, but the kind of medical language which is still around helps to obscure the links to colonization, exclusion, deprivation, loss of heritage and identity, and so on. Okay, and of course power isn't always bad, power is neutral. We've trained as professionals, if we are professionals, to try and support people and use our power for the best advantage to them. But the framework necessarily looks more at the negative uses of power because that's how we understand distress. Okay, I'm going to whiz through these next questions quite briefly, but essentially, how did it affect you? This naturally leads on from power. These are not separate questions, by the way. It's not power plus threat plus meaning plus threat response. You can't really think about power without thinking about what are the kinds of threat did that pose to this person? And you can't really think about that without being aware of the kind of meanings that are involved in that process. So abuses of power can affect people in all sorts of ways. Their relationships, their emotions, their ties to the social and community settings, their material circumstances, and their value base and meaning making. So we're back to ideological power again, to saying it is also an abuse of power not to give people the chance to develop their own identities, values, meanings, make their own sense of their lives. And there are many ways of preventing people from doing that, but medical model thinking is one. Okay, what sense did you make of it? What is the meaning of these experiences? So we see human beings as actively making sense of their world. We're not victims of psychiatric illnesses. We are trying to make sense of the difficult things that have happened to us. So what do we mean by meaning? In the framework, we tried to expand what we mean by meaning, because there are ways of thinking about meaning that we think are too individualistic, like the classic CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy approaches, look at the sort of cognitions in your head and tweak them. And we have a big programme that's rolled out across England, which is all about giving people sort of 10 sessions of CBT in which they are encouraged not to feel so depressed and anxious about the fact that they're poor and unemployed. I mean, I've stereotyped it a bit, but you can see how a very individualistic understanding, you need to change your cognitions, is a subtle form of blaming people. And what we want to emphasize is that meanings don't come from nowhere. The meanings we have in our heads are partly derived, they're made and found. So they come from all around us, from what we read, from what we hear, from our relationships, from everywhere. So we can't understand any aspect of the power, threat, meaning framework responses separately from their meanings. There are all sorts of common discourses around. What do we commonly understand in a given society about what it is to be mentally ill, what it is to be a good mother, what it is to be a happy family, what it is to be a First Nations person? All of those things come with a whole set of meanings attached to them, which to a greater or larger extent shape our own meanings. And of course, at the same time, as I've already said, those meanings that we're encouraged to take on as individuals are very often ideologically shaped. So we're encouraged very often by more powerful bodies, institutions, people to take on meanings that serve power, not necessarily meanings that are accurate and helpful and that give power to everybody. So there's a big myth that's been exploded in the UK recently, and it's received publicity across the world. I don't know if it's reached the Yukon, but one of my colleagues, Joanna Moncrief, published an article exploding really pretty comprehensively the chemical imbalance myth, the idea that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance, which of course we've been sold for 30 or 40 years. It was clearly an ideologically driven myth. It was never true. There was never any evidence to support it. It profited pharmaceutical companies. It profited the psychiatric profession because it seemed to give justification for their existence. It was very much at the expense of many people who took drugs that they probably would not have wanted to do had they been offered a much more accurate explanation, had they not been told, you must take this because it'll correct the chemical imbalance in your head, in your brain. Finally, what do you have to do to survive? So this part of the framework draws quite a lot from trauma-informed practice, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So this roughly covers the area of what in psychiatry we call symptoms, but both in the framework and in trauma-informed practice, these are not symptoms, they are survival strategies or threat responses, same thing. And we all use threat responses. None of us lived as a perfect or easy life. So here's an example of threat responses, and they go roughly from the top to more biologically embedded threat responses, if you like. Because we're all part of the same species, no matter what part of the world we live in, there are certain things that we share in common, like a fight, flight, freeze response, if you like, when we're in danger, very useful things, but can become unhelpful if we can't get out of that state of mind and body. And if you go down the list, you'll see that there are also different ways of types of threat response which are more culturally specific. So, you know, there's room for cultural shaping about whether, for example, we use alcohol to deal with our difficulties, about whether we're encouraged, as we are in the UK, I always put this up as one of my own threat response symptoms, overwork. If life's difficult, I tend to spend far too much time in front of my computer. For me, that's a threat response. No one's going to label me and lock me up for that because it's socially valued. So there are all sorts of threat responses, and different cultures will shape threat responses in different ways, although some of them will be relatively similar across cultures. Okay, and the framework argues that these are, you know, they're there for reasons. So it doesn't, in our view, make a lot of sense to say, what is the cause of depression or what is the cause of anxiety or whatever. Any of the things we think of as symptoms or threat responses can be used for a number of core reasons that as human beings we all need to deal with. We all need to regulate our overwhelming feelings, for example. None of us like to feel overwhelmed by difficult feelings, so we might use a whole range of ways of threat responses to deal with overwhelming feelings. None of us want to be abandoned and rejected and hurt, and we might use a whole way of coping with or avoiding being hurt or abandoned. So, restoring the link between threats and threat responses, a main purpose of the framework. Psychiatric practice tends to sever that link. Someone comes along with a symptom, we don't say, well, how are they using that symptom to cope with something difficult in their life? We say, oh, it's depression or it's schizophrenia or it's a personality disorder and we need to treat it. And in contrast, the framework tries to put back the link between threats and threat responses. Another way of saying the same thing is to put back the link between personal distress and social injustice. The link that is severed when we apply a diagnostic understanding. And this always seems to be a very puzzling phenomenon, because actually a lot of this is common sense. Nobody is surprised. We all know that people living in poverty are more likely to feel depressed and desperate. Of course they are. We are no longer surprised that people who've experienced severe trauma histories might hear voices. But as soon as we know that, we then switch to start thinking about epidemics of an illness called depression and new drugs and all this kind of stuff and new clinics to treat all these people, rather than dealing with what are very obviously the kind of core causal factors. And one of the main ways we sever the link between threats and threat responses is by applying a diagnostic understanding, as I've said here. But this in itself, this is not about professionals doing bad things. We're all, if we're professionals, doing the very best we can, often in very difficult circumstances and for the best of reasons. But we ourselves are sucked into a whole way of thinking and practicing, which of course has many vested interests supporting it. I'm going to give you a very brief example of disconnecting threats from threat responses. So this is an article about COVID in the UK, and we've had a lot of alarmist headlines about we're going to have a pandemic of mental health problems very soon, if we haven't got one already, which seems a very unfortunate coincidence. We've just had one pandemic, now we're going to get another one. So, but actually, if you unpick some of what the impact of COVID was, what you find is the people who are most at risk from so-called mental health problems after COVID were people who actually had the most difficult time. They're people at the risk of domestic abuse, people whose job situations were very uncertain, people who worked in frontline services, people who with poor physical health, people who had few people around them when we were in lockdown, and so on. And all of this in the UK, and I imagine it applies here as well, almost all minority ethnic groups had higher rates of dying from COVID-19 than the white British majority. So the people who suffered most were the people who were least powerful, had most, living in the least just situations. What COVID is highlighting, I think, is not an epidemic of mental health problems, but the catastrophic levels of injustice and inequality in our society in Britain. So, who does this narrative benefit? Well, in the UK, we're getting massive calls for infinite number of new psychologists, new nurses, new doctors, new clinics. We're not seeing massive calls for more equality of income and less isolation and all the rest of it. So I wrote this article. In ordinary language, people with more to be exhausted, depressed and anxious about are feeling more exhausted, depressed and anxious. The general picture is the population is largely resilient. It's not a pandemic of mental health problems. We interfere with a pandemic of mental health thinking. We don't need mental health and psychiatric solutions. We need social solutions. Okay, I'm not doing too badly. I hope you're bearing up. Everyone's still awake, I think, so that's good. I'm going to look at a slightly different angle of the framework, which is called general patterns. So, as I've said, the framework is about helping people to construct, if they want, it's all optional, of course, narratives or different understandings about their distress. But it isn't just about one-to-one narratives. The framework also has made an ambitious and an incomplete attempt to work out whether, in fact, there are meta-narratives, there are overall narratives in a given society, of which our personal stories are just a small example with its own. Every personal story has its own personal flavour, of course. But it seems to us there are general narratives in society which both feed into and support the personal narratives that we construct about ourselves. So the reason we wanted to have a go at putting together some general patterns is because if we're trying to do the very ambitious thing, which we are trying to do in the framework, which is to move away from medical understandings, we need to replace medical patterns with something else. So in medicine, a pattern is what enables you to make a diagnosis. We have well-established patterns about what goes wrong in your pancreas, on the production of insulin and the symptoms that arise from that, and the sugar in your urine and so on, that allows us to label a particular set of symptoms as diabetes. So actually medical diagnosis is a process of identifying patterns. That's what the whole field is based on. And sorry, got slightly distracted there. So what we want to do is to try and come up with a form of patterns that are suitable for people's emotional suffering and distress, not medical patterns. And the difference about the patterns we've tried to come up with is they're not based on biology. Of course, they have biological aspects, but they're based on meaning. They're shaped by meaning, which necessarily means they're going to change over time. They're going to be different in different cultures. They're not fixed for all time. They don't have simple cause-effect links. They describe what people do, not what people have. They're verbs, not nouns. We need to get away, we think, from you have this condition, you have a personality disorder, you have a psychosis, into very broad patterns about you are employing these kind of meanings and threat responses in order to survive. What you do, not what you have. And if we can establish that reasonably well, and based on the evidence we have, although often interpreted in a different way, we can at least start to make the claim that we've outlined a very different, we haven't made this claim, of course, we're one step along the road, but we're outlining a very different fundamental paradigm to a medical one. Otherwise, the risk is anything else we introduce will essentially be kind of just added on to what we already have, a bit like trauma-informed practice, or limited in practice by having to run alongside the medical model. Okay, so I don't know if this is rather a lot of, this is just to give you a tiny, tiny example of what one of our general patterns looks like. We've called it surviving social exclusion, shame, and coercive power. So I've done quite a lot of work in forensic settings with people working in the criminal justice system, and I've always asked people to bring along a typical example of someone you might be working with supporting, and it nearly always turns out that this person's personal story is a version of this general pattern, which is a well-evidenced pattern. I won't read it out because I think it'll take too long, but essentially this is about, this pattern describes someone whose family's origin is likely to have lived in environments characterized by threat, discrimination, deprivation, and social exclusion. They may have experienced absent fathers, institutional care, and homeless. Parents and caregivers are likely to have been struggling with their own histories of adversity and unable to create secure attachments in their children. The children may have grown up witnessing domestic violence, and they tend to use survival strategies of cutting off from their own and other people's emotions and remaining highly alert to threat. That's probably a familiar kind of description, isn't it, of a lot of people we know. This isn't a pattern for criminals or people who end up in criminal justice systems, but it is found in quite a lot of usually male people who end up in prison, in the UK at least. I don't know if this translates culturally. But the second part of the pattern is almost more important because it tries to show where that comes from. It tries to show where the personal distress links to the wider patterns of injustice. So social messages and status comparisons may have imparted a sense of worthlessness, shame, and injustice, which may be managed by various forms of violent behaviour. Unequal societies in which economic inequality increases social competition allows these dynamics to flourish. This may have a particularly strong impact on disadvantaged men who have greater incentives than women to compete, achieve, and maintain high social status. So, as I said, that is not a bad description of a lot of, in the UK at least, men who may end up in criminal justice systems, but not just those. I mean, in thinking yesterday at some of the presentations I heard, it was clear that some were describing patterns of young men and young women from the Western Arctic, for example. It seemed like there were slightly different patterns for young men than young women, but clearly patterns were being described, it seems to me, at a very broad level about loss of identity, loss of heritage, loss of culture, loss of community. Okay, this is coming up to the final bit, you'll be glad to hear. So, I want to touch on this aspect while acknowledging I'm talking from a white Western perspective myself. But I think it's very important to notice that a particular form of injustice that the diagnostic system exports is in relation to non-Western, to indigenous groups. So there is a movement called the Global Mental Health Movement, which is exporting diagnostic models and all the accompanying drugs with them across the globe to countries and cultures that didn't have it, didn't know they needed it, and were almost certainly doing better without it, if you believe the research. So I'm sure a lot of this is well motivated, and I'm sure some of it's useful, but the basic principle that white Western diagnostic knowledge, which is failing badly in Western cultures, mental health outcomes are not improving. People are on the whole start being patients, they end up being patients for lives in psychiatry. The arrogant assumption that actually we are justified in kind of exporting this model elsewhere from the point of view of the UK. So psychiatrists like Suman Fernando argue this is simply another form of colonialism. Yes, or less obvious, but just as damaging as earlier forms. That's a really provocative statement, isn't it? I actually think there's a lot of truth to it. It's not colonialism in the obvious form in which we're used to seeing it in terms of taking over a country's ruling bodies and discriminating in all sorts of gross ways against the native populations, but it is also a form of colonialism, and one that people have sort of been encouraged to welcome and want, our superior white Western knowledge, apparently. Well, I think Western medicine has a lot to offer. I wouldn't want to be without Western medicine. I wouldn't want to be dying in childbirth anymore because of lack of antiseptics and all the rest of it. I would want to have a heart transplant if I needed one. But psychiatry, of course, its claims to be based on medical science, I think, are very, very dubious. And in the framework, we see it as a kind of ideologically driven project. So, what do we do instead? Well, if you took a path, threat, meaning framework perspective, but it's one of many, we're really not saying this is the only way of looking at it, but from a path, threat, meaning framework perspective, you would expect to find different expressions of distress in different cultures across the world and within particular societies. So actually, you would be able to say, from a framework perspective, we don't need to export our model to places that don't actually need it. And we particularly don't need to try and squeeze what seem from a white Western perspective to be unusual expressions of distress into a white Western model. That's also a form of colonialism and epistemic injustice. So this is a puzzling dilemma from the point of view of DSM systems. So DSM systems, DSM-4, 5 and so on, DSM-4 was very, very puzzled, as is DSM-5, by the existence of expressions of distress which are common in some societies but not in the white Western context from which DSM was developed. So what does DSM do about that? They've invented a category called culture-bound syndromes, where they put a lot of these unusual expressions of distress from their point of view, waiting to find out, are we going to put this under unusual form of schizophrenia, or are we going to put this under way of expressing depression in China? Now, I think it's a nonsense because all expressions of distress are culture-bound. That's what we've just been saying. All expressions of distress are culture-bound. It just is, if it's your own culture, you can't see it. It seems like the way things are. But I'm going to show you a tiny example from this culture-bound syndrome section of DSM-4. It's about spirit possession, which appears in DSM-4, awaiting to be assigned to a diagnostic category. Apparently there's a version in Uganda where civil war has resulted in widespread brutality and abduction and the forced recruitment of children soldiers. Some young people report that their identity has been taken over by the evil ghost of a dead person. Sen has been found to be associated with high levels of war trauma and with abduction, and the spirit was often identified as someone the abducted child had been forced to kill. So your heart goes out to those children who are forced into becoming soldiers, doesn't it? But do we need to say, oh, well, actually, we're going to describe this as an unusual form of schizophrenia? Well, from a power threat meaning point of view, we would not be saying anything like that. We would not be exporting the framework either. We wouldn't say, understand this through a power threat meaning framework perspective, but we would be saying, well, if that's the understanding that makes sense in that culture, if that's the word that has evolved to describe it, then that makes perfect sense. And actually, what you're describing in different terms is various forms of power, threat, meaning, and threat response. Yeah, different language, different way of describing it, completely appropriate for that culture, if that makes sense. So there wouldn't be the drive to kind of impose this or assimilate this into a Western model. So the framework actually wants to go well beyond the usual causal factors in distress, well beyond thinking about trauma and abuse and neglect, important though those are, and think further back about the distant causal factors. Well, of course, they're very current in lots of forms, but that may go back many, many years, histories of colonisation, intergenerational trauma, and the framework also wants to include and respect and value local and indigenous understandings, not seek to impose Western ones. And of course, many local indigenous understandings are narrative-based. So there's a kind of compatibility there. They may be narrative-based in a very different sense than would be familiar to me as a white Western woman, but nevertheless there's a commonality in that we're talking about narratives that make sense in a particular time and culture. And as these quotes say, what is much less important, what we don't want to get caught up in, is what is the correct diagnosis. What we do want to be thinking about, does this narrative have narrative truth? Does it seem to fit? Does it seem to explain? Does it seem to offer ways forward? If it does, then that's what we need to go with. Okay, and we've heard about some of this already. So in our toolkit of things that we may see as ways of healing, depending on where we are and who we are, we might include all these things. We've heard some really inspiring examples yesterday. I'm sure we'll hear more today and tomorrow. And these are actually things that, you know, from my own perspective, have been very much lost from traditional Western understandings. It's the reverse of imposing our Western understandings that needs to happen. We need to reclaim some of these former forms of wisdom. Okay, I'm going to briefly describe a visit to New Zealand I made in 2019, where I didn't meet Diana, but I met one of your colleagues there. And we wrote a joint article, didn't we? I hope it's okay to quote it. You can tell me if I've got it wrong. But in New Zealand, a couple of years ago, I had the great privilege of being invited to various places, including Auckland, where I asked if we could have a 2-day workshop in which on the first day I'd be mainly presenting the framework. On the second day there were a number of Māori attenders. Well, they were there on both days, but the second day was devoted to Māori understandings of distress, which of course are very, very different from mine. They were very new to me. They're essentially, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, they're kind of narrative-based stories about creation stories about the gods and so on. And Diana and I wrote an article afterwards jointly in which she said that in your work, Diana, you're not actively and consciously using the framework, but you were kind enough to say that the existence of the PTM framework supported your argument, among other arguments, that for Māori people particularly, there needed to be culturally appropriate understandings of distress, not based on diagnostic systems. Hence all the amazing work you and your colleagues have done, which we're going to hear about. You described the PTMF as a distant cousin, and I really, really like that phrase, a distant cousin. As distant cousins that we hope get on well. We don't necessarily see each other all the time. We don't necessarily have the same ideas and way of looking at things. We often don't, but we get on well. We respect each other. Nobody's trying to dominate the other. So after the Auckland workshop, there was this feedback, which was very encouraging about, you know, this approach has potential. I want to emphasise again, not saying any Indigenous and non-white communities need to adopt this framework, but if this was the dominant Western framework instead of a diagnostic one, we would instantly, I hope, lose our desire to impose a form of knowledge that isn't appropriate and doesn't even work in our own Western settings on other countries and cultures. Okay, I also went to Australia on the same trip, and there I was fortunate enough to attend a workshop where some Aboriginal people were present. And after I presented the framework, we heard from some of them. And I did a bit of reading up before I went, and it seemed to me that the Australian government has, over the years, made some efforts to acknowledge, as an extract from this document says, the enduring legacy of colonialism on Aboriginal life, which has affected multiple generations, extends to all dimensions of the holistic notion of Aboriginal well-being. This has resulted in unresolved grief and loss, trauma and abuse, violence, removal from family, substance misuse, family breakdown, cultural dislocation, racism, discrimination, and so on. This will be very, very familiar to you here. It seems to be the tragic story of many, many, if not all, Indigenous communities. So that's all very promising. In the very same document, there's a chapter, Chapter 7, Mental Illness in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Peoples. What's that doing in there? A number of factors therefore contribute to the accuracy of diagnosis or definition of any mental illness in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And it goes on to talk about mood disorders, psychosis, personality disorders. I must say I found that incredibly depressing, because what is that kind of stuff doing there? You know, this is actually what we need to get away from. And this is a classic example of disconnecting the threat from the threat response, isn't it? One chapter we're talking about the horrendous persecution amounting to genocide of the Aboriginal people in Australia. Next chapter we're talking about how they've all unfortunately developed mood disorders, and we need to be very careful to define those and diagnose those correctly. So this is the trouble with, you know, we live in a world very much dominated by the medical model. I don't think it's going to vanish overnight, but it very much undermines and contradicts and reduces the power and effectiveness and you know, of alternative approaches that are much more appropriate. When I was in Australia, I met a professor who'd worked with lots of Indigenous communities, and he wrote this fascinating paper about the number of Indigenous women, mostly, who are being diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. And he wrote in this paper, he put the official criteria for diagnosing borderline personality disorder in italics, as you can see there: frantic attempts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. That's a criteria for diagnosing borderline personality disorder. And under it, he put the real reasons that people might feel that way. So he's put decades of forced separation from caregivers and family. Is it wonder there's a fear of abandonment? He's also put identity disturbance, marked and unstable sense of self-image and of self. That's one of the criteria for borderline personality disorder. He has noted that many of the Aboriginal people suffer from loss of family, kinship system, land and country. Is it surprising that they have what could be described as identity disturbance? So as we can see, there's an extra layer of epistemic injustice when we seek to impose these models on some cultures. Inappropriate, intense anger or difficulty controlling anger. It seems to me, and to any rational person, I hope, that there are many, many, many reasons for Indigenous people in Australia and everywhere to feel grief and anger. So, okay, I've nearly finished, you'll be glad to hear. I'm even going to skip a slide. So I want to emphasise that the idea of the framework is not just about, it's for professionals to do with clients, it's for anybody, it's free knowledge. And we've been very pleased to hear that some peer groups, in the UK peer groups, people in contact with psychiatric services who set up their own forms of support without any professional input, have taken it on, have decided to work through, in several cases, work through the questions themselves, think together about the forms of power abuse they've been subjected to, the meanings they've attributed it, and so on. And this quote is from a peer group facilitator in New Zealand who's done exactly that for her peer group. It's about the importance of thinking about power. The power discussions are some of the most heartbreaking but also exciting to facilitate. Heartbreaking because it can be really hard for people to suddenly experience the realities of how power is negatively operating in their lives. It genuinely is like watching the sunrise over the hills as they connect the concept to their own lives. In each group, there have been at least one person who experiences a fullness of anger over the following week as they come to terms with seeing the oppression in their lives, presently and or across time. However, it is also exciting in that people start to shift the responsibility from themselves and their bodies back to the situations they faced. And if this includes harm from people to those that have acted those who have acted like that towards them, you see some people literally sit up straighter. Not easy to take on board the full impact of power in your life, in anyone's life. Opens up new ways forward, can help to restore a sense of agency and power. This is from another peer group. This woman has given me permission to share her story. This is what she put together as a result of thinking about the framework. She had spent many years in psychiatric hospital being told she had personality disorder. With the aid of the framework, she put together this rather different story through thinking about power, threat, meaning, and threat responses. I won't show you those bits, but I'll show you her summary. Adverse childhood experiences led to complex trauma throughout my life. Constant repetitive cycles of coercion, powerlessness, and multiple forms of abuse have not only had a lasting effect on my interactions with others, sorry, I've got very small print here, but are also impacting on my physical, emotional, and psychological well-being. My energy levels are depleted from being constantly broken and distressed by disempowering an authoritative and controlling mental health system. However, though I'm dispirited and struggle to trust others, my relationship with my peers and family are protective factors that motivate me to find the strength to utilise my experiences to self-educate and self-advocate while campaigning for trauma-informed services and improve mental health provision for other survivors. So you can see that's a very, very different story from I have a personality disorder which I'm probably going to be stuck with for life. Very pleased to say that this woman, Amanda, has joined us to offer training in the framework. Again, it's really not just about professionals, it's about peers and survivors as well. And this is almost my final slide. I'm going to be doing a workshop on this tomorrow. Some of you are going to be at it. But just want to show that the framework does have application, I hope, in services as well as out, we think. So there are a number of wards in a large part of central and northwest London that have adopted the framework, and over a period of 4 years have found dramatic reductions in levels of self-harm, restrictive interventions, improved staff morale, and much better feedback from service users. So there it's necessarily running alongside a medical model to quite a large extent, but even so it's been able to introduce a kind of a parallel narrative that's actually been very helpful. The project is now being extended across all their inpatient services and their perinatal services, their complex emotional needs services, their crisis teams, and indeed everywhere that people come in contact with them. Final slide. Storytelling and meaning-making are universal human skills. The framework provides evidence of the central roles of narratives of all kinds as an alternative to diagnosis. Narratives are a means of witnessing and healing both in and beyond services. Art, music, theatre, etc. are just as valid as written narratives, as are community ceremonies, myths and rituals. We need the restorative power of truth-telling. Recovery is a process of reclaiming our experience in order to take back authorship of our own stories. Thank you. You've been very, very patient. And that's it. So I will... I will defer to Cameron as to whether or not we have time for questions, but if we don't, I'm around, so do come and grab me if you've got anything else you'd like to ask. Shall I? Yes, please do.
I've just got some feedback for your slide. I really enjoyed your presentation. I can see how it aligns with what we've practiced as well. Some of the feedback from the Auckland workshop near the bottom, it says valuing of stories, myths and narratives. The problem I see with that is that we're told that our whakapapa, our genealogy is a myth. And
Yeah.
actually our genealogy that we
Yeah.
And one of the tools that we use in Tapuwhare Wānanga is whare waha. And that's about our mouth and the words that we use to grow. So it's important that we use the language.
Yeah.
And so that's our genealogy and our
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm writing it down. And actually, I'm unhappy with the word. I've gone through most of my slides and eliminated the words myths because it has a kind of derogatory air to it, doesn't it? It's one of those ideologically used words, actually. Like, these people have myths, we have scientific knowledge. So actually, it shouldn't be in there for all sorts of reasons. So I will delete it. Thank you for that. Any other comments? One person? I'm guided by you, Cameron. I'll step down if you think it's time to stop.
Thank you so much. Your presentation was very informative and a lot of stories that people can learn from. One question and then a comment. That framework that you mentioned that is being expanded in the UK health systems, do you have broad support from the National Health Services of the UK generally? Because what we have seen normally, many of these initiatives that happen to strengthen any health systems, there has to be proper political backup, proper systems that support that.
Yeah.
And then the other part of it, I bring this forward because you discussed this at the case study of Uganda, where a lot of issues have happened in terms of now the common frame chain.
Yeah.
I come from that particular region, and I relate very, very well with the story. But the biggest problem gets down to, again, political support to strengthen the health system, to support whatever initiatives that are there. So do you see such things happening, as I mentioned, for the UK? Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. When the framework was published, we actually didn't have a strategy for disseminating it or seeing if people would take it up. Our strategy was to have no strategy, because we thought if this is worth something, people want to take it up. What we didn't want to do was impose anything, particularly in the way the diagnostic model has been imposed. So everything that's happened has happened through people approaching us and being interested. So the short answer to your question is the NHS isn't offering us formal support, and nor have we asked or expected them to do. What we sometimes recommend to people if they want to introduce elements of the framework into the NHS, we say describe it as trauma-informed practice, because that's actually in the NHS long-term plan, and everyone thinks it's a good thing even if they don't really know what it is. So that's one way of getting it in. So the hospital trust that I showed you, that's a grassroots project that has actually won over the senior managers in that particular trust. But I don't think it would work to approach. I think revolutions happen from the grassroots up, basically. And actually, I think if we were too explicit about what we aim and what we're thinking and approach some senior NHS managers, I don't think we get a very good reception. So that's my comment. Okay, thank you very much.